Westridge Middle School was the kind of place where rules never needed to be spoken aloud. Everyone knew who belonged to which group, who held the power, and who was nothing more than an extra in the cruel hierarchy of the hallways. Eva Sinclair, at 13, had already learned to move through that territory with utmost discretion. She lowered her head, spoke little, and made sure not to give anyone any reason to notice her more than necessary. Being one of the few black students at the school was enough to attract stares, some filled with curiosity, others with pure disdain. But Eva didn't care. Or at least, she tried to convince herself that she didn't. However, there was someone who cared to remind everyone that she was different. Connor Tate. He was the definition of untouchable, the son of a wealthy businessman, surrounded by influential friends, with a smile that deceived adults and a cruelty that only teenagers could perceive. For him, humiliating Eva was not just a distraction, it was a sport. It started with small provocations, bumps in the hallway, notebooks mysteriously falling to the floor, nicknames whispered in the corridors. But when he realized that she wasn't reacting, he went further. He wanted a response. He wanted to see her break. Connor's game reached a new level in the cafeteria, where an audience was guaranteed. It was always like that. The students surrounded the tables, divided by status, and he reigned at the center of the most influential group. Eva tried to blend into the routine, grab her lunch, and find a corner where she could eat in peace. But that day, Connor decided that wouldn't happen. With a rehearsed move, he bumped into her at the exact moment she was passing by, causing her tray to fall to the floor. The noise echoed through the hall, and before Eva could react, he was already laughing, pointing at the dirty floor. "I guess you don't have to worry about lunch anymore, huh? With the money you have, you shouldn't be eating that much anyway." The laughter spread through the cafeteria like wildfire. Eva stood there, motionless. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the noise around her. Every part of her wanted to react, to scream, to grab the tray and throw it at him. But she couldn't. She knew how it would end. If she retaliated, she'd be labeled as overreacting. If she cried, she'd give him exactly what he wanted. She took a deep breath, picked up what remained of her lunch from the floor, and without looking at anyone, headed toward the trash. The humiliation burned like embers within her, but it would not bring forth a tear, not in front of them. In the days following the cafeteria incident, Connor did not slow down. In fact, he seemed more determined than ever to destroy Eva. He realized that she wouldn't give in to direct provocation, so he changed his strategy. What had once been physical attacks and public humiliations became insidious. He started spreading small lies, cast like bait in the corridors, in whispered conversations, on the school's social networks. First, he insinuated that Eva had an aggressive temperament, that she was the type to blow up at the drop of a hat. Then, he distorted stories, turning small, casual interactions into alleged fights, in which he, the poor and innocent Connor, had been threatened by her. The rumors spread like poison, each one more absurd than the previous. The final blow came one afternoon, when an image began circulating on the student's Instagram. The photo showed Eva in the school parking lot, apparently with a disturbed expression, staring at Connor. The problem? The photo had been edited. Someone had tampered with the image's saturation, darkened the shadows, and enhanced every line of tension in her face. The caption, "Psycho Sinclair can't control herself." It was all that was needed for the entire school to have an excuse to turn against her. In the hallways, suspicious looks followed her. Some people laughed, others whispered. And the worst part, no one, absolutely no one, said anything against it. Eva was no longer just a girl who was the target of jokes. She was now someone to be avoided. The isolation was complete. Eva felt the impact of the photo immediately. Before, at least she had the illusion of being invisible, of being able to survive the days without drawing attention if she remained silent. But now, every glance that met hers carried something different. It was no longer just contempt or mockery, it was silent judgment. Even the teachers seemed to hesitate when calling on her to answer in class, as if they had swallowed the distorted version that was circulating. During break, while passing by a group of students, she heard one of them say, without bothering to lower his voice, "She looks like she's going to freak out at any moment." The laughter that followed was like a cold blade against her skin. Eva clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shrink away. She didn't want them to see that they were getting what they wanted. But inside, something was breaking a little more with each comment, with each sidelong glance, with every time a chair next to her in class remained empty. When she got home that night, she tried to pretend that nothing had happened. Her mother asked about school, and Eva answered in short sentences, forcing a neutral tone. Her father, however, was more observant. Chief Sinclair watched her for a few seconds before setting down the papers he was holding and crossing his arms. "Eva," he said, with that tone of voice that she knew meant that there was no use in lying. "What's going on?" She tried to escape, but he was already holding his cell phone, the screen lit by the cruel post that was now spreading throughout the town. The silence that ensued was suffocating. Chief Sinclair swiped his fingers over the screen, zooming in on the image, analyzing every detail of the manipulation. When he finally looked up, his face showed not just concern, he was furious. Chief Sinclair wasn't a man who let himself be swept away by easy anger. He had spent his life facing situations that demanded control, patience, and strategy. But seeing the manipulated photo, seeing the look in his daughter's eyes, reflecting the weight of that injustice, stirred something deep inside him. He didn't ask if Eva was okay, because he knew she wasn't. He didn't try to downplay the situation, because he knew it was serious. Instead, he took the cell phone and began noting down names. Who posted this first? His voice was low, controlled, but carried an unquestionable firmness. Eva hesitated. She didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want her father to get involved and make things worse. But when she looked at him, she saw that it was no longer just about her. He saw something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. "Connor," she finally replied. But everyone shared it. Her father nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. Then, without saying another word, he grabbed his coat and left. Eva stood there, feeling her stomach tighten. The conversation with Principal Dawson took place that very night. Chief Sinclair didn't wait for the next day. He didn't send an email. He didn't make a formal phone call. He showed up at the school, demanded to be heard, and placed the cell phone on the principal's desk, with the edited image open on the screen. "Tell me what you see here," he said, keeping his voice calm, but making it clear he wasn't there to be ignored. The principal, a man used to smoothing over problems and keeping the influential parents of the town happy, looked at the photo with discomfort. "Well, this is concerning, of course, but they're children, Mr. Sinclair. This happens in every school. We need to teach resilience as well." Chief Sinclair narrowed his eyes. "Resilience?" He swiped the phone, showing the flood of offensive comments below the photo. "Tell me, Principal, if it were the son of one of your friends, would you still call this a joke?" The silence that followed was revealing. Principal Dawson cleared his throat, clearly avoiding the screen. Chief Sinclair's rigid posture seemed to shrink him into his chair. He tried a more conciliatory approach. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Sinclair, but we have to be careful with exaggerations. Connor comes from a very respected family in this community. We can't act impulsively." "Oh." It was the response that Chief Sinclair had already expected. He knew how these situations ended, with a symbolic warning, with a backstage handshake, with the victim being advised to move on. But this time, it wouldn't be that way. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the principal's desk, and leaned in slightly. "So tell me, Dawson, what would happen if it were my daughter spreading lies about Connor, if she were the one who had edited this photo to make it look like he was the aggressor?" The principal opened his mouth to answer, but then closed it again. He knew the answer. Everyone knew. The police would have been called, Connor's parents would demand his immediate expulsion, and Ava's reputation would be ruined forever. But Chief Sinclair wasn't there to listen to excuses. He straightened up and adjusted his coat lapel, keeping his gaze fixed on the principal. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice calm and without room for discussion. "Either the school takes action against this harassment now, or I take this to another level. I can call the press, I can involve the school board, I can open a formal investigation into administrative negligence. Choose." Principal Dawson swallowed hard. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he wasn't dealing with just any father, but with someone accustomed to dismantling systems that protected the powerful. After a long silence, he took a deep breath. "I'll speak with the disciplinary committee," he finally said. Chief Sinclair simply nodded. He already knew what the real decision was. The next morning, a buzz was already running through the corridors of Westridge Middle School. Something was happening. Teachers whispered among themselves, and students fiddled with their cell phones with intrigued expressions. It wasn't long before the news spread. The Principal Dawson had called Connor and his parents in for an emergency meeting. That was not common. Normally, Connor's problems were resolved discreetly, without major repercussions. But this time, it was different. Chief Sinclair hadn't allowed the case to be swept under the rug. He wasn't just an outraged father. He was a man who knew which buttons to push, how to transform a complaint into a real problem for the school. And it worked. When Connor walked down the hallway on his way to the administration for the first time, he wasn't surrounded by his usual group. He walked alone. The confident smile he displayed every day had disappeared. Ava, sitting at her desk at the back of the room, didn't know exactly what would happen, but she felt that something had changed. For the first time, Connor wasn't in control of the situation. His power, the kind that came from his family name, money, connections, had encountered an obstacle he couldn't simply bypass. But even so, Ava couldn't relax. She knew that the world wasn't fair. She knew that Connor had privileges that in the end would probably protect him. Only now, there was a difference. He wasn't coming out unscathed. For the first time, someone was holding him accountable. For the first time, the invisible rules that had always favored him were being broken. The principal's office felt smaller than usual when Richard and Meredith Tate entered. The couple exuded the same confidence that always accompanied them at social events and school meetings. Richard, in an impeccable suit, shook the principal's hand as if he were sealing a contract. Meredith, with a forced smile, looked around, as if the whole situation were a major inconvenience. Connor was by their side, his head down, but Ava knew it wasn't remorse, it was strategy. He knew that his parents would handle everything, and that he would soon be out of there without any real consequences. Richard turned to Chief Sinclair and extended his hand. "Chief, right? Look, we know this has gotten a little out of control. Boys will be boys. I'm sure there's no need to make a big deal out of it." But Chief Sinclair didn't move. He didn't even look at the outstretched hand. His gaze pierced Richard Tate with an uncomfortable firmness. The silence stretched until Meredith chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension. "Let's be reasonable, okay? Connor is a good kid. Everyone likes him. This kind of thing happens all the time." Chief Sinclair tilted his head slightly. "Happens all the time?" he repeated, as if weighing the words. Then he turned to the principal. "Dawson, if it were my daughter who had manipulated a photo to destroy another student's reputation, would we be having this conversation?" The principal looked at the desk. Richard crossed his arms. "That's an exaggeration," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "We can handle this like adults." Chief Sinclair smiled in a way that was anything but friendly. "Great. Then let's talk like adults about bullying, harassment, and legal responsibility." Richard Tate let out a short laugh, but there was something unsettling in his look. He didn't like being confronted, much less by someone who wouldn't bow to his status. "This is a school, Chief. We're talking about teenagers. Do you really want to take this to a legal level? Chief Sinclair maintained his firm posture. Yes, I do, because if it were my daughter in place of your son, you would have already hired a lawyer. The silence in the room grew heavy. Principal Dawson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Meredith crossed her legs, impatient. This is ridiculous. Connor isn't a criminal. He's a kid. You're going to ruin his life over a joke. Chief Sinclair leaned slightly forward. You don't care about ruining my daughter's life, do you? The Tates exchanged quick glances, but did not respond. So let's put an end to this farce. Either the school takes action, or I take this to court. The impact was immediate. Principal Dawson knew he couldn't continue ignoring the problem. Connor Tate wasn't just any student, but Chief Sinclair wasn't just any father either. If this case ended up in the newspapers, the school would have to explain why it ignored such a clear case of harassment and cyberbullying. The principal cleared his throat and finally turned to Connor. The school has a code of conduct that needs to be respected. Manipulating images to defame a student is a serious violation. Considering the history of previous incidents, your punishment will be a 1-week suspension. Richard Tate abruptly stood up. This is outrageous. My son doesn't deserve that. But Dawson avoided his gaze. The decision had already been made. Connor, who until then had remained silent, clenched his fists. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the situation. The news of the suspension spread faster than any rumor that Connor had ever created. In the hallways, the atmosphere was different. Students exchanged surprised glances, some murmuring among themselves. No one had ever imagined that Connor Tate would face a real consequence. He had always been protected, untouchable. But now, he walked with his head down, his shoulders tense, while whispers followed him. When he passed through the cafeteria, some people averted their eyes. Others, once loyal to his circle, simply ignored his presence. He was still influential, still had money and connections, but something had changed. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he used to make others feel. Eva, on the other hand, felt a subtle shift around her. It wasn't as if, suddenly, everything had been resolved, but the emptiness around her began to fill, albeit timidly. The day after Connor's suspension, when she entered the classroom, she noticed that the chair next to hers, which used to remain empty, was occupied. Not by a friend, not by someone trying to make a grand gesture, just a classmate who, without saying anything, chose to sit there. During break, someone left a packet of cookies on her desk. No note, no explanation, just a gesture. Small, but different from everything Eva was used to. For the first time, the school was beginning to change. Not because of Connor's punishment, but because the people around realized that they could no longer pretend not to see. The changes did not come in a grand manner. There was no public apology. There was no cinematic turnaround where everyone became Eva's defender overnight. But small signs began to appear. The silence that once meant complicity now carried discomfort. When someone tried to make jokes at her expense, they no longer received the same laughter. On the contrary, some averted their gaze, others exchanged nervous murmurs. It was as if, for the first time, people were realizing that watching and doing nothing was also a choice. Some began to greet her in the hall without exaggeration, without trying to seem heroic. Just a nod, a recognition that she existed. And for Ava, after so long being treated as invisible or as a target, that was something. At the end of the week, Lena Carmichael, one of the girls who always orbited around Connor's circle, approached Eva in the cafeteria. She didn't sit at her table, nor did she try to offer excuses or hide her discomfort. She simply stopped beside her and hesitated for a few seconds before saying, without looking directly at Eva, "I never laughed at him, but I also never said anything, and I think that was just as bad." Eva didn't respond immediately. She could have ignored it, could have said it didn't matter, but the truth was, it did. Not because she wanted Lena's friendship, but because she knew that if someone like Lena was acknowledging the mistake, it meant that perhaps Next time, the school wouldn't remain so silent. Eva didn't respond to Lena immediately. She simply observed the girl, noting the way her shoulders were tense, how her fingers gripped the strap of her backpack. Lena wasn't there to receive forgiveness or to ease her conscience. She was there because, in some way, she knew she had done wrong and wanted to acknowledge it. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. Yeah, it did. That was all Eva said before getting up and leaving the cafeteria. There was no anger, no resentment, just a silent acceptance that things were changing, even if slowly, even if imperfectly. That night at home, Chief Sinclair sat next to Eva on the sofa. He didn't ask how she was, because he knew that some answers only time could bring. But he looked at her with the same attentive gaze as always and said, "Boys like Connor will always exist. There will always be someone who thinks they can control others through fear, through manipulation." He paused as if carefully choosing his next words. "But what you did, Eva, was refuse to be silenced. And that changes things." She didn't respond, but something within her settled with those words. The next day, upon entering the school, Eva noticed something that perhaps no one else would. The path that always seemed narrow and suffocating now appeared a little more spacious. Not because the problems had ended, not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because she no longer walked the same way. She didn't lower her head. She didn't hurry her step. For the first time, she felt that she occupied her own space, without needing to ask for permission. And perhaps that was the true impact of it all. Not Connor's punishment, not the small changes in the school, but the fact that from now on, anyone who tried to do what he did would think twice. Because now, everyone knew that not everyone would remain silent, not everyone would let it pass, and more importantly, that no one had to face it alone.